So I've called the talk Affordance-based lesson planning, how to plan positively for the unpredictable. And it draws upon research I did back in 2015 and also work I've done with teachers based on this research since then. And it's looking at the question about how we can better prepare ourselves for the things in lessons which happen, which we can't necessarily predict in advance. In other words, to plan for the what some people would call unplannable. But of course, hopefully, there are some elements of it that we can plan for. So I'll begin first of all by just providing a little bit of background, what affordance is, where it comes from. I'll then talk a little bit about what I'm calling here the structure, freedom, tension in all teaching. I'll look at some, well, kind of a summary of research about that indicates how our planning practices change over time as we gain experience. We'll then look at both novice teacher planning and experienced teacher planning. It's really nice to see that there's plenty of people who are at the start of their career, and that's what I would call a novice teacher. And those of you who are like me, no longer a spring chicken, as we say in a British English idiom. And then we'll look at a little bit of evidence there is for affordance-based planning supporting it, and hopefully, inshallah, plenty of time for questions, comments, and critique at the end. Thank you, Dalia, as well, and Magdalena as well. Welcome to you both. Great. Oh, and Abir. Hey, Abir. Oh, Abir, I'm going to even show an image of some of your students later in Alexandria in Egypt. Great. Okay, cool. So let's, oh yes, and just to note as well, also if there are teacher educators and EOT line managers, the talk will also have some interesting, useful stuff for you as well, for things like teacher observations and so on. Great, okay. Cool. So let's have a look at this notion of affordance. What does it mean? Well, it comes from the work of James J. Gibson, an American psychologist, also a very early ecosystems writer. And he argued that affordance is a very important concept because it essentially constitutes that which nature can offer to the individual, be it a person or any other organism. He was talking about animals, but it can even exist for plants as well, and fungi, I suppose, any domain of life. So if you look at this picture here, we've got some kind of obstruction across a lake or a water body. And you can imagine different animals using this for different reasons. A fox or a deer might run across those logs to avoid getting wet in the water. A beaver might see them as an opportunity to build a dam, already something partly constructed, or a duck may choose to kind of nest in those reeds by the tree trunk. But of course, affordances can be both positive and negative. And the affordance could be negative for the duck. For example, if the fox that's running across the branches suddenly sees the duck's nest and steals the eggs. So affordances provided by nature can be both positive and negative. And they only exist when we exploit them, when we make use of them, be it as animals or as people or as plants or whatever. So how does that relate and link to teaching? Well, Leo van Leer, a very interesting writer, now dead unfortunately, wrote a very interesting book back in 2004, looking at an ecosystems perspective to language learning, and it influenced me as well a lot. And he argues that we can also use it usefully to describe how the learning environment provides opportunities for the learner to learn. And these can be positive, negative, effective, or ineffective learning. And it enables us to see the learner as an active participant in the lesson, such that learning opportunities arise as a consequence of participation and use. In other words, there is a very close link between affordances and our exploitation of them to facilitate learning. The learner perceives and acts on the occurrences and ambient language around him or her. Today, I'm going to contrast affordance-based lesson planning with the alternative, which I suppose is what we might call outcomes-based lesson planning, which offers a more simplistic, not necessarily wrong, but in language teaching, it often is not the best way to go, shall we say, and undifferentiated in a kind of a teleological link between input to uptake. And uptake, the two things together. So the assumption that input does lead to uptake. And those of us who have been teaching for a while, Chris mentions not being a spring chicken as well either. Those of you who have been teaching for a while will know, of course, this really important point that just because you've taught it doesn't mean they've learned it. Arguably, if they haven't learned it, you haven't taught it. And that will depend, of course, on your definition of what teaching is. Right, nice, cool. Interesting chats and notes in the chats as well. Thank you, guys. Cool, right. So there we go, a definition of affordance that links both to Gibson's original work and Leo van Leer's. Let's have a look at some examples in the classroom. Here are two images I've taken from different sources that show learners in a classroom doing something. We can see two girls in the image on the left. Let's imagine they're primary school learners at early levels of literacy in their English language learning. And they're playing a game on a board where they have to spell letters by standing on the right, spell words rather, by standing on the right letters. All kinds of things can happen in this lesson in terms of both of them improving their spelling skills, potentially teaching each other new words, potentially spelling things wrongly as well. Affordances can be negative and the other student could pick up on that. And therefore that's a role for the teacher to spot that. And we got the picture on the right as well, which is a group of learners doing something which those of you who've done a CELTA hopefully will know about. It's not something we can do in all classrooms because the classroom layout there is rather optimistic for some countries, but and contexts, but it's called a running dictation activity. So you've got learners working in pairs, one of them sitting down, writing what the other one is dictating to them, but they have to run to a text somewhere around the room, remember a bit of it and bring it back to their peer. And of course, this kind of activity involves all four skills: reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and it involves social interaction between the learners. So there's often going to be a lot of language around the tasks, such as learners directing each other, giving each other advice, and so on. So these two activities, you know, there's a huge amount of learning that may happen during them, both planned and unplanned. Feel free to kind of reflect on any thoughts you have about what kind of activities, what kind of learning could happen in this lesson. And you'll probably see that there's quite a few different opportunities for learning. Often an activity will be included by a teacher in a lesson because they can think of one specific reason for using it. But the important thing to note is that the activity itself can provide affordances for all kinds of learning. And just to give you a really simple example, in both of these images, one thing that we often underestimate that's extremely important in, say, primary and secondary education is the social and emotional learning that can happen from learners interacting together, learning from each other and with each other, learning to interact together. If you teach in a class who don't share a common language, then those learners will have to do that in English, and therefore it contributes to what some people would call authentic language in the classroom. And if they do share another language, then in fact the learning can happen multilingually, or I would say translingually, that one learner might explain, for example, in the image on the left, what a word that she's just spelt out means to her peer using the mother tongue or a shared language. Cool, and thank you for those examples. So Maria mentions learning the alphabet, clarification requests, exactly in both of these images. Thank you, Ailey. The students will need to ask each other, sorry, what did you mean? What did you say? What was that word? Receiving input from each other's, adapting. Thank you as well, Chris, and Miriam as well. Yes, writing a paragraph, that's interesting. Description, interaction, and negotiating meaning, Maha. Thank you. Yeah, and that will definitely happen a lot in one of these running dictation activities. So just two simple examples of affordance in a lesson. And to provide a brief anecdote as well, I remember watching an expert teacher in India a few years ago. His name was Gajan Antayade, excellent teacher. And one day he walked into the classroom and the learners weren't really interested in paying attention to the class. So rather than trying to start his lesson, he noticed what the learners were more interested in, and the girls were looking at a photograph. And so Gajan very politely sidled over to them slowly, started asking them about the photograph. The girls were very happy to talk about it. The photograph became the focus for the lesson for a short period, and Gajan was able to steer the lesson towards his intended lesson aims, or rather the part of the curriculum that he wanted to work on. So it's a nice example of how, even as Bobby was saying, some of the things that happen at the start of the lesson can become affordances for learning themselves. Yes, great, cool. Thank you. Some interesting points here. Leanne, yes. Running dictation, young students draw pictures. That's interesting. Yes, great. Cool. Okay, right. Let me move on. So the next thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is this, what I would call the structure, freedom, tension in education. Bobby mentioned this quote from Bruce Lee, a good teacher cannot be fixed in a routine. Well, to my mind, all teachers have to work in some kind of routine and constraint. These can be constraints of time, such as the timetable, the lesson start and the lesson finish. We can't change those. Those are fixed. They might be constraints of content in terms of the curriculum. You may work to a national curriculum if you're a primary or secondary teacher, or you may work to say an exam-based curriculum or even a textbook as your syllabus. These are things that whilst we can add and take out, there are some constraints on exactly what we can do from this perspective. And of course, rules. We have different rules in the classroom in the break. Some of the people were asking Bobby about the rules and the challenges they have with learners breaking the rules. And it's important to have those as well. And again, particularly if we're looking at primary and secondary contexts. But we also all know that learners need freedom to do all kinds of stuff in the class, which could be applying what we've taught them, experimenting with a new idea, experimenting with language, developing their ideas, for example, through pair work, and importantly, in language teaching to communicate. And of course, there is ample evidence. Bobby nearly touched on some of it when he was talking about some of the research, that some aspects of learning don't follow a structured syllabus. A good example of this is implicit grammar learning. The way that we learn grammar from the point of view of implicit learning for spoken use doesn't necessarily follow the way that teachers may want to teach it. It seems to follow what is called sometimes an internal syllabus in the literature. And of course, there are many interesting and enjoyable lesson moments that are unplanned. There are numerous approaches which emphasize this side of things. Bobby was mentioning the book by Scott Thornberry and Luke Meddings, called Teaching Unplugged, which is part of Dogme ELT, and that's the same reference you see there. But there's also things like improvisational performance, Yinger and Nick Sorensen's work, responsive teaching. What else have we got? Reactive teaching, I'll show you that link. And importantly, the recent book by Richard Chin and Danny Norrington Davis talks about working with emergent language. Again, something that Bobby touched upon. Does anybody know any other terms for this kind of emphasis of the need for us to be responsive or improvisational in our teaching practice? Marianne put starting a lesson from almost nothing. I'm not sure if that's it. That's a response to this, or it was from something earlier. But I think it's really interesting that whilst this side of things is emphasized, I think we have to, as teachers, to recognize that structure and freedom exist in equilibrium. Each teacher in their context will face a different balance of these. And a lot of misunderstandings between teachers working in different contexts will often be when one teacher doesn't actually understand the extent to which another teacher has structure or freedom. So it's important to remember that both of these are important parts of teaching, and we can't teach without some degree of both. Oh, thank you, Lizzie. Yes, the long conversation. Cool. And it was about, what's about structure and freedom? Oh, interesting. I'll have to look that up. Is it online? Do share the link, Lizzie. Great, cool. Okay, so let's have a look quickly at planning practices over time. This is very much a collation of a lot of research, both my own into teacher expertise and that of other teacher researchers as well, educators and researchers as well. And we see that there's an important relationship between how long it takes us to plan a lesson and our experience. And it basically goes like this. Now, note that there are no specific figures on these scales because this is the rough trend. Individuals will vary to some extent, obviously. And we can see that with time, both our written planning and mental planning goes down. That's not surprising. And it goes down very steeply to start with. So if you're just doing your CELTA or your post-CELTA, don't worry. Those 3 or 6 hours it takes you to plan a lesson will come down rapidly within a few weeks or months. And if you're more experienced, you may be at a later point in your career where the written planning itself may become negligible. And this links to what is, I think, one of my favorite quotes about planning by Jim Scrivener. Jim Scrivener made the point that planning is essentially a thinking skill. It's about imagining the lesson before it happens. And he offers this really important piece of advice to prepare thoroughly, but in class teach the learners, not the plan. That's easy to say for those of us who are experienced, but if you're a brand new teacher, you need to basically prepare thoroughly, and in the class use that lesson plan to help you to get through what you're going to say, just as I'm doing today. And you can see that I've put 4 different timescales on there. I'd be interested to know your reflections here. Which of these 4 stages would you say you were at? One might be on your CELTA course or pre-service teacher education. 2 might be 1 year into the job. 3 might be after, say, 5 years, and 4 might be like those of us who've been teaching for longer than we would care to admit. And the extent to which you actually do either written planning or mental planning or both. It'd be interesting to know, because in a moment, I'll show you what the tendencies are, and then you'll be able to reflect on the extent to which you fit within these tendencies. Great. Yes, and we had Samsung. I'm sure Samsung is not your real name. Allow for spontaneity. I bet you're referring back to my previous question there. Jonathan is at stage 3. So Jonathan, how much written and mental planning do you do? Anna is it between 1 and 2, but nearer to 1. Yeah, but and how much written planning do you do and mental planning? Okay, Leanne mentions, yeah, is at stage 3. So Leanne, somewhere kind of experienced teacher and mainly mental planning and some notes. And Fatima, oh, that was a direct message, Fatima, thank you. But Fatima says 4, she's at stage 4, some mental planning, but mostly spontaneous. And we see this a lot. Great, more spring chicken references. Okay, great. Thank you. And keep kind of reflecting on that and the amount of planning, because you may see yourself reflected in this part of the talk. And what we see here, just as somebody has just said, I've already forgotten who it was. Yes, oh, and it was Fatima. Fatima, you mentioned it to me in a direct message. Do put it in the general chat. Mainly spontaneously, this ability to improvise increases. And whilst many of us at the start of our career are capable of doing it, because there are so many skills that we need to internalize, to proceduralize as teachers, it may be difficult for us to improvise early on in our careers, and it will gradually increase with time. Cool, great. So there we go, a little bit of information about planning practice over time. Let's now have a look at how we can facilitate affordance-based lesson planning or affordance-based responsive teaching at different stages in the career. Let's start off with stage 1, kind of from 1 to 2 in early career, what we might call novice teacher planning. Well, at this stage in our career, written planning is essential to early teacher learning. We need to plan on paper so that we can get our ideas together. And importantly, once we've got them together, to be able to remember them in the class. Many of us need that and as we're starting to teach. It's often required in initial training, such as on the CELTA, and often after, for example, in mainstream education, many teachers are expected to write a lesson plan for every lesson. Not so common in the private sector, but it's important to note that. And both mental and written planning take a lot of time at this stage, as I've mentioned. And the lesson plan pro formas, the documents that we have to fill out, the templates, are typically oriented towards outcomes. And I'll come back to that in a moment by what I mean by that. But they're also sometimes editable or negotiable, and something which I think a good line manager will always be happy for a teacher to kind of adapt a lesson plan pro forma if it's appropriate to their teaching context. I'm going to present some ideas from my own research, and there's the paper from 2015, but also some ideas from Melissa Lamb from IH London. One of her ideas, another good person to get to speak, Lizzie, by the way, if you get the chance. Yes, so here we go. Some key suggestions for novice teachers. Often novice teachers tend to focus on specifically either the outcomes they're planning towards or on the materials. But it's a useful tip to focus on the main activities you plan to include in your lesson. And specifically choosing those main activities. Bobby was mentioning about, for example, starting with a fluency activity, but he was also talking about an exercise. So if you've got one fluency activity, one exercise, and a third activity, maybe a reading, shall we say, focus on specifically what those activities will involve, in other words, the actions that the students will be engaged in. These activities offer what we might call predictable affordances, and try out the activities. You can learn as a novice teacher by trying them out both in, for example, if it's a speaking activity with 2 people working in a pair, or even in a group of 3 with a third person observing and noticing what language is being used, what skills are being used, and whatever potential learning is happening. And through that noticing process, you'll begin to develop an ability to predict what affordances happen, and therefore how you can convert those into learning opportunities. If you look at the things I've put there in the notice kind of list, all of these are things that can then be converted into what we might call either learning outcomes, lesson aims, intentions, or I would call them learning opportunities and their potential learning opportunities. And all of this process, as I've mentioned at the bottom there, becomes automatic in the sense that we can start to imagine what affordances and activity will include as we gain experience. But the question I'm asking now is, how can we facilitate this through the planning tools? Well, this was the focus of the 2015 article that I wrote, and I argued in the article that many lesson plan pro formas that we give to teachers don't necessarily help them to plan for affordances very well, to plan for the unpredictable. And I offered a number of suggestions for how to change them. The first one was I suggested that it's a good idea to switch from talking about learning outcomes to talking about predicted learning opportunities. Outcomes-based lesson planning typically expects teachers to identify things that the learners will have done by the end of the lesson. The difficulty here is that nobody knows, because it is impossible to predict what learning happens inside a learner's head by the end of the lesson. We may want to believe that we facilitated this learning because the learners have responded in this way, but the reality is it's much more difficult to pin that down. And whilst we may be able to demonstrate that for one or two of the learners, we can't necessarily do so for the whole group of learners. And this includes what are sometimes called smart objectives. And smart objectives are something that tend to annoy me. They don't come from education, they come from personnel performance management. They're a very good way to make sure that somebody is doing what you want them to do as a line manager, but they have no evidence in education as a basis in education at all. They're specific, measurable, whatever, time-based, but the reality is that language learning is unpredictable. It's not specific and it's incremental. It can even be regressive in the sense that we can sometimes go back to an earlier stage before we move forward. And therefore, the idea that we can and should be using learning outcomes to describe and predict learning is not only optimistic, it's simply wrong. It's not based in evidence. So I argued in the paper that we need to move from this idea of learning outcomes when we're planning language learning lessons to predicted learning opportunities. And when you describe predicted learning opportunities, rather than having some kind of by the end of the lesson learners will prediction, you simply describe the verbs that are potentially likely to reflect the learning that might happen. So in the lesson in question, in this example from the paper, it's a listening lesson. It's got mainly a listening activity, but also some kind of speaking opportunity practice relating to it. And in the predicted learning opportunities I've put here, I've put 6 different things which could happen. And I've even included the learners' initials for the learners I think they may happen for. The AM, for example, NM and JP are the initials of specific learners in the lesson, because I see that they're the kind of people who may need to develop those skills or who may be apt to develop them. And with all of these skills, the aim isn't to achieve them all. The aim is to notice which ones are happening during the lesson, and then after the lesson to be able to reflect on them and to understand, to recognize as a teacher what learning did happen. So in this sense, rather than attempting to predict the unpredictable in the lesson, we try to describe the potential learning that may happen and then become aware of it as the lesson is happening and reflect on it afterwards. And that example is in the paper itself. So this is one potential change that could happen on, for example, the lesson plan pro formas we often use. Another set of changes come on the procedure section of the lesson plan, where I argue that firstly, we need to move away from this idea of set times to time frames, and time frames should always be flexible. In other words, it shouldn't be 3 minutes, it should be 3 or 4 minutes. It shouldn't be 10 minutes, it should be 10 to 15 minutes and so on. The optional stages is important as well, and these two things link together. Just as my talk today has several optional slides, if I've got time for them, lessons nearly always need to have optional stages that we can use potentially at any point. As Bobby mentioned earlier, we might want to put a certain optional stage later or earlier in the lesson. The third and probably the most important change that I'm arguing for in this lesson plan pro forma is this final column. A lot of lesson plans have this on the front page, but it needs to be in the stages or the procedure section of the plan. And instead of talking about what are sometimes called anticipated problems, we need to actually recognize that these are affordances. I didn't use affordances here because it can, as a new term, it's not familiar to everyone, but I've called them possible occurrences and responses, so that we as teachers are able to recognize that these can be both positive and negative, and we need to recognize that they can also be differentiated between the learners. So the examples you can see in the lesson plan example, if NM and BG, and these are the initials of 2 students who are weak listeners, struggled, I'll give them the option to read the tape script this time. So it provides, if you like, an opportunity for us as teachers to predict not just general challenges and general possible things that happen, but also specifically for individual learners, this idea of differentiation, which Bobby also touched upon earlier. And in the 7th stage of the lesson plan, I've got a kind of a possible occurrence and response as well. Cool. So there we go. These are some kind of suggestions which I would recommend can improve any lesson plan. And if you're, as a teacher, working in an institution that has an outcomes-based plan, then have a look at the article itself, which it's available freely online with VOT Journal. I'll provide the link at the end. But if you Google Anderson affordance-based lesson planning, you should find it. And I've also got an example of the lesson plan itself, which I'll share here. Hopefully that QR code will work. Do let me know if it doesn't. And this is a Microsoft Word document, so you can edit it yourself, and importantly, allow your teachers to edit it so that the lesson plan pro forma they're using is responsive to their needs as teachers as well. That kind of thing. Cool. Yes, I'm just looking at the chats. Yes, Samsung, I wish I could know your real name, Samsung. Do tell us. I asked people to include a flexi stage. Absolutely. And the flexi stage is kind of this extra improvised stage in the lesson plan as well. Great, cool. So there we go. Another interesting idea that I want to share briefly is a really interesting one that comes from Melissa Lamb of IH London. Melissa, are you with us today? I'm not sure if she said she would come or not, but we might have colleagues from IH London as well. And this is also provided in Richard and Danny's book, which I'll come back to a little bit later, if I may. But one of the interesting things about this plan is that Melissa Lamb imagines a very different shape to the lesson plan. It's circular, and it focuses on the lexis in the lesson, that before the lesson, rather than attempting to predict specific outcomes, we predict what kind of language could come up, what kind of language could be useful in the lesson, and how we as a teacher can then draw upon it and build on it to help learners to learn. And this is all related to the idea of emergent language, which I'll come back to in a moment. Right, how am I doing for time? Okay, cool. Great. Okay, just about right. Great. Yes, so it's an interesting idea, I think, this. And if you are at an early stage in your teaching, and particularly if you have a lesson where there's likely to be a lot of new language, then using one of these pro formas, something like this, could also help you to predict that. I can't remember which way it was, but I think in their book, Richard and Danny refer to it as doing it one way, from the small bits to the big bits. But Melissa actually recommends going from the functions of the lesson and then focusing down into the sentence frames, the potential grammatical structures and words and collocations you can use. But I think what is interesting here is that this shape of a lesson plan template can be used either way. And that will depend, I suppose, to some extent on your needs as a teacher. Cool. Okay, so there we go. And I'll come back to that book in a moment if you're interested in it. Let's now have a look at experienced teacher planning. And Abir, I can see you're still with us. You may recognize some of these teachers. These are some of the wonderful experienced teachers that I had the privilege of working with in Alexandria in Egypt, in Pharos University with Abir. And amazing teachers they were, very experienced. These guys do a CELTA so easily because of their experience. And it was fascinating working with them as well. And so I'm using them as a kind of the kind of starting shot slide for talking about experienced teacher planning. By experienced, I would say probably post 3 or 5 years. The research on teacher expertise indicates that we need at least 7 years to reach that, but probably a little bit before that. Several things will have happened in your teaching by the time you reach this point of your career that often make things a little bit easier, particularly for those of you who are post-CELTA and spending a little bit more time planning. So we can see there, written planning is not always necessary. And there are many expert teachers who don't write written plans, and there is research on this conducted by myself and Gould and Tanner. If you ever want to remind your line manager that you can do a good job without writing stuff down. Personally, I can't. I always have to plan. I always have to write it down because I just forget. Most of them, in fact, do brief notes, and I'll provide some examples of that in a moment. But mental planning is still required. And this is the very important thing to notice, that when we get to a level of experience, we still have to imagine the lesson, as Scrivener puts it, before we get into class. But experienced teachers can multitask, so they'll be imagining the lesson when they're on their way to work, when they are sitting at home the night before. And those of us, if you've ever, like me, suddenly woken up first thing in the morning and imagined that you actually had a good idea for the lesson at night. And this is all part of the preparation process. The materials often act as aid memoirs, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Many experienced teachers actually plan on the materials themselves. They often only ever make use of lesson plan pro formas for senior observations, except for those who have to use them. And there's some ideas here which I'll draw upon, including from my own work, and also Richard and Danny's book, and Melissa Lamb again. We'll come back to her point. Sorry, I just had to mute myself there. It was one of those moments where you have to burp in a talk, and it's never very nice to hear that. So, right. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples of experienced teacher lesson plans. This is all they do. These are from two colleagues based in London, and that's all they do. This is two examples of lesson plans for lessons for private adult language school teaching. These look familiar to any experienced teachers? Yes, Mariam says, I use a memo only. Yeah, Suyog. Suyog, you sent that message directly to me. Suyog, can you put that message in the general chat? Because I think it'll be interesting for everyone to read, and then we can discuss it. Cool, great. Yeah, let's have a look at some others. Here are two other examples of how experienced teachers plan. It may be quite difficult to read, but you can see on the one on the left is a general EFL Global textbook, and the one on the right is the textbook used in Maharashtra state in India. And you can see that these two experienced teachers are actually planning on the materials themselves, including things like writing down the answers, writing down extra activities, potentially crossing out things they're not going to do. And this is another way in which these can serve as the template, if you like, on which they plan. Isabella, more detailed. Have you got one to show us, Isabella? You could put a photo in the chat if you want. Yeah, and so it's interesting to note that experienced teachers still do plan, and the majority of them do write something, but definitely don't write a full-length lesson plan. And I thought I'd also reflect on my own planning, a nice reflexive moment. Here's an example of one of my lesson plans recently from February. This is on a module on the MAT SOL at Warwick University. And what's interesting that I always do, and I do it with talks as well, I map everything onto a scaled time frame. So one line on the piece of paper is 5 minutes. So I can actually see time passing. I've got exactly the same thing here in my current lesson plan, and hopefully I will be on time. The arrows indicate opportunities for extension or retraction, but the lines across there are moments where I definitely want to move on and talk about something else. And even the break there is slightly flexible about when it will happen. And Suyog is here. He was in that session, Suyog, I think. So he'll remember if it actually happened or not like that. But the important thing to note here is that for me personally, I still rely on fairly detailed notes compared to other experienced teachers. Yeah, anyway, and I always also rely on my slides, just as many experienced teachers rely on their materials to prompt me and to help me to remember what to do next. Thank you, Anya. Great, yeah. I find it really useful because it shows the proportion of time realistically, and it enables you to block out. Another useful tip if you're kind of interested in making sure that what doesn't happen in your lesson is the thing that Bobby was warning about, that the most important activity in the lesson falls out of the end of it, to plan that first, to organize the time for it, and then to notice how much time you've got for other activities in the lesson. So let's now look at this idea of emergent language. Bobby mentioned it earlier, and I'm going to provide a definition from my own book, this Trinity Cert TESOL Companion. For those of you, I think we mainly got CELTA graduates here, but if anyone's done the Trinity Cert TESOL, you might be familiar with this. I called emergent language that arises naturally during the learning process, often produced or needed by learners, that is then focused on through clarification with support of the teacher. In their book, Dealing with Emergent Language, and just to note, in other words, what I'm talking about here is that language that is the product of affordance, language that comes up during the lesson. And in their book, Richard and Danny expand on this much more. They provide their own definition, which is also very good. But importantly, they contrast it with what it isn't. And for them, it isn't target language. Particularly those of you doing a CELTA or post-CELTA will remember this term target language as the thing that you have to teach, the thing that you have to demonstrate the learners have learned. And the important point that Richard and Danny make is that emergent language is everything else, all of the other language in the lesson. I would argue, and they also argue, that we can do a lot of predicting about what emergent language happens in the lesson. But importantly, Richard and Danny also argue that it can actually occur and be drawn upon in a wide range of different lesson shapes. And by shapes, I mean the structures such as the presentation, practice, production lesson structure, my own context analysis practice structure, and also to lesson shapes which are much less structured. Bobby was mentioning task-based language teaching, and that would fall under this category. And you also mentioned dogme ELT, which would also be less structured as well. Yes, so Siog just mentioned this point here. He's also mentioned a direct message about my time management skills. Thank you, Siog. But he mentions, would you consider Melissa's model as a lesson plan or possible target language? Absolutely, Siog. It's essentially both, in a sense, that what she's doing is she's looking at not target language, but potential language. And this is why they like it in, Richard and Danny use it in the book, that it isn't necessarily language I want to target, I want to come up. It's language that could come up and we need to work on. Cool. Okay, so hopefully that's clarified that. But it's a good point that in a sense it is the language that is going to be working with in the lesson rather than any kind of time-based shape for the lesson. But it's always useful to have alternatives. So there we go. In Richard and Danny's book, they also discuss 5 lesson stages where emergent language work can happen. The lead into the lesson, again, Bobby was mentioning this, responses to texts, grammaticalization tasks, something which Danny Norrington Davis also discusses in his other book. Sorry, these are 2 very good books, I have to mention them. And communicative tasks and feedback stages, they can happen in all of these lesson stages. But one question that many of us are interested in kind of analyzing and finding answers to is how can we kind of create a lesson structure that enables us to deal with emergent language? And I'd like to offer a few potential frameworks for an emergent language focus. There's Lamb's planning template as well. I've already mentioned that, but this is my own from a paper I wrote in 2020, a critique of Rod Ellis's modular framework for lessons, for planning, for curriculum planning. And I call it the Tate framework because it has 4 stages: text, analysis, task, exploration. This is a framework that maps well onto many published materials in a wide range of contexts, that we often have texts and even contexts that introduce new language, followed by analysis phases of the lesson where we might analyze language either from the text or language for a task that follows. Then we have a task in the lesson or some kind of opportunity to use language meaningfully, communicatively. And then after that, I've argued in this framework, we need a final stage there, what I've called the exploration stage, and it makes the 4 letters TATE, Tate. And in this stage, I mentioned the point that among other things that can happen, there can be a focus on emergent language. And this is, I think, probably the phase in any lesson where teachers both feel most comfortable working with emergent language because it's come up in the task. The teacher then has a little bit of an opportunity to notice it and then to work with it after the task itself. But of course, emergent language focus can happen at other stages in the lesson. An important thing to note here is that in their book, Richard and Danny argue that we can work with emergent language not just at this stage in the lesson, but at any of these stages. And I think if they were to modify this framework, they would argue that we can work with emergent language both when we're working with the text, the analysis, the task, and the exploration. But certainly it's this exploration phase when after they've done the task, it's quite a natural thing for teachers to kind of look at some aspects of correction, look at some aspects of language they could have used, and also to praise learners for the useful language they used and to share it with others. 2 really important things to note here is that during this lesson phase, it's always difficult for us as teachers to know which bits of language to work with, because if you're working in a large class, different learners will have produced quite a wide range of variety of language. And that takes experience, a sense of know-how. So there we go. And the other thing to mention there is that we can also use this exploration stage for quite a wide range of things beyond that. Learner reflection on their own emergent language and other things as well. Great. Cool. Right. Now, another 5 minutes left. So let's have a quick look at some 2 final kind of things, areas of recommendation I want to author. These are some reflective questions for experienced teachers, educators I've used here to refer to teachers, educators of any kind, because I think it applies not just for language teaching, I think this applies to all types of teaching. Despite the fact that Bruce Lee argues that a good teacher cannot be fixed into a routine, the reality is that all teachers working in all classrooms that I know of are fixed into a time frame. And it's that time frame that is one of the most important constraints on teaching. Working in a university, I can think of many examples when I've watched experienced lecturers spend too long on the early phases of their lecture or presentation and then having to rush through the later ones. Anybody who studied in university will always also have that memory probably. So here's some useful questions for you to think about. And feel free, by the way, to choose one and offer your thoughts in the chat or your own reflections on it. Question number one, do I often spend more time on early activities and have to rush later ones? This is specifically the point that Bobby was mentioning and why he thinks it's a good idea to do the fluency work earlier in the lesson as a result. Yes, Martha, time management is one of the greatest enemies of any teacher, but it's a key skill we all have to learn. And that's why I think it's really important to be aware of it. Do you ever get annoyed that you didn't have time for something in a lesson? Well, if so, have you actually put in place steps to ensure that you do in the future, such as planning the final activities first? The third question, how do I decide whether to follow a tangent or not, whether to go in a specific direction? So, for example, in my talk, I chose to follow Suyog's question and to discuss a little bit because I felt this was a very relevant challenge. But there are other comments I mentioned, I saw in the chat that I didn't have time to go with. And yes, question number 4 is a really interesting one, I think, and one of my kind of questions about working with emergent language that I'm never 100% sure about. How do I know whether one student's emergent language is useful for everyone in the class to focus on? Somebody's unmuted, I believe. Lizzie, can you see if you can find who that is and help them to mute themselves? Thank you. Yes, how do I know whether one student's emergent language is useful for everyone in the class? Which bits of emergent language do I work with? When negotiating content choice with learners, how can I make sure that all voices are equally heard? So in other words, one of the key things that we might want to argue is to make language more relevant to learners, we can negotiate which bits of language we focus on specifically today in the lesson or even next lesson in a future lesson. And ensuring that all learners, not just allowed ones who want to speak up, are heard is an important part of that. And also, what feedback have I received from my students on issues of pace, curriculum coverage, and time management that may help me to work out whether I'm, for example, managing time in the lesson correctly, dealing with the emergent language that comes up, and planning for the affordances appropriately. These questions, feel free to take a copy of them, take a screenshot. They may be useful for pair work discussion in your school, in your institution as well. Razor chooses number 4. Yeah, it's a challenging one, isn't it? And number 5, Mariam. Yeah, but Mariam, what's your answer to that question? That's the interesting one for me. Cool, right. And then some suggestions for line managers, those of us who conduct senior observations of experienced teachers, or for yourself when you become a line manager in the future. And importantly, if you are the subject of observations, feel free to take a screenshot of this again so that you can use it if your line manager makes certain demands of you which you don't think are necessarily best placed. So I would offer the following recommendations for line managers. First and foremost, have a flexible lesson plan pro forma that they can adapt, reword, etc., to enable them to deal with the affordances of the lesson and the emergent language that comes up. Consider using an affordance-based lesson plan pro forma, such as mine, which is adaptable. Recognize, this is an important point here in the quote, not the quote rather, but the question. Recognize that if they normally teach without a detailed lesson plan, experienced teachers we're talking about, by asking them to complete a detailed lesson plan, you guarantee that you will not see a normal lesson from that teacher. Okay, this doesn't apply to novice teachers. I would still, if I was doing an observation of them, I would still encourage them to complete a fairly detailed lesson plan. But for experienced teachers, it isn't necessarily something they do naturally. So we need to justify, if we want them to produce that, why we want them to change from their natural, normal practice. And also this question, which one is likely to be more useful for your purposes as a line manager, which are monitoring, evaluation, teacher appraisal? and which one is most likely to be more useful for their own personal development, the real lesson that they always teach or the overplanned one. So feel free if you wanted to take a shot of that, and if your line manager asks you to complete a lesson plan of the type that you don't like, this is your evidence that there's a reason why not to. Good, great. Now, I'm just about to finish, Lizzie, don't worry, I've just got one more slide that I want to share. And this is going to be a little bit of evidence from a really interesting study by Syed, done partly based on my own recommendations, but also on prior discussion of affordance in language teaching and learning. The paper is available online as well. You should be able to get it through the QR code. And it was really surprising to me because it indicates, even though there wasn't a great deal of study, only 45 days of study, Syed found that using a test-retest research design of general language proficiency, that the students in almost all 4 skills, the students who were exposed to lessons planned with an affordance-based strategy outperformed the control group on general proficiency, as well as speaking, writing, and reading scores. So not all 4 skills, but 3 of the 4 over the period. So it's an interesting study there, if you're interested. Cool. Now, let me just show a few of my references here in the list there. You can see the book by Leo van Leer right at the bottom, The Ecology and Semiotics of Language Learning. That was very much an inspiration for me for this talk and this area of my research. I really recommend it. Jim Scrivener's book there, Learning Teaching, where that key quote about lesson planning being a thinking skill, that's on there as well. And a few others there as well, including Richard Chind and Danny Norrington Davis' book on working with emergent language, and a few of my own pieces there. The 2015 article where I look at the lesson plan pro forma and deconstruct it from an affordance-based perspective, and also the Tate model, also in EOT Journal, as a curriculum design framework. So there we go. Liz